Okay.
I'm recording it to my computer and it worked. So,
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Heidi. Okay. With that taken care of, let's go ahead and dive into our content. So as I said earlier, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to begin this session with a land acknowledgement. So let us acknowledge with deep respect that the land upon which we gather today are the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, Comanche, Osage, and Kiowa nations and peoples. We respect the indigenous stewards of this land, past, present, and future. We remember the painful history of genocide and forced removal under settler colonialism and commit ourselves to dismantling structures that perpetuate this legacy and the status quo. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken, may they reaffirm the ties of all Indigenous peoples of over 48 historic tribes to these unceded lands we call Colorado. Welcome to this webinar. This is part of People Over Polluters. This is a new initiative of 350 Colorado that combines legal action and strategic communications and public education to rein in oil and gas pollution in Colorado. So this webinar is part one and focuses on the legal action strategy of our People Over Polluters campaign. For tonight's webinar, we'll begin with introductions. Then we'll cover oil and gas extraction pollution, a bit about the Clean Air Act and Title V permitting. We'll cover some opportunities for legal action to intervene for health and safety. Then cover how you can support this work. We'll have a little time for questions and answers at the end, and of course, closing with many thank yous. So now let's do some introductions. We are so pleased and honored to have with us some special guests from the Center for Biological Diversity. So Ryan and then Jeremy, would you please introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Mahar. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a staff attorney with the Center for Biological Diversity, and I work with the Clean Air Act primarily with a focus on oil and gas issues.
And yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Jeremy Nichols. I'm a senior advocate with the Center for Biological Diversity. Work very closely with Ryan in our environmental health program, finding ways to leverage the Clean Air Act to hold polluters, and in particular fossil fuel polluters, accountable to protecting people and our planet.
Thank you both so much. And I'm Bobby Mooney. Many of you know me as our Beyond Oil and Gas campaign director at 350 Colorado, and I'm stepping into a staff attorney position with 350 Colorado as well. I'm excited to be here with you all today. And now we're going to just speak a little bit more about our two organizations that are part of this collaboration. So Ryan, would you like to say a few words about the center?
Sure. So the center's work historically and presently is largely focused on tackling the extinction crisis, but Jeremy and I work on with a team called the Environmental Health Program, where we focus on the nexus of public health and the environment, recognizing that threats to one are threats to the other. And so that allows us to really hone in on the interaction between polluters and communities, and environmental well-being. And again, we're focused more specifically on air pollution.
Thank you. We're so excited to have you here in this webinar, and I'll share a little bit more about 350 Colorado. We are a Colorado-focused nonprofit that works to build the local grassroots movement to solve the climate crisis and transition to a sustainable future. And from our very beginning, 350 Colorado has worked to protect people and our planet from the harms of oil and gas extraction, aka fracking, here in Colorado. So a little bit of a refresher on fracking or hydraulic fracturing. It's a heavy industrial process where millions of barrels of water are mixed with hundreds of undisclosed and often toxic chemicals and then injected into the earth under extremely high pressure to force oil and fossil gas to the surface. And both research and on-the-ground experiences have proven that fracking poses grave risks to public health and clean air and water and a stable planet. back in the 20th century, most oil and gas production in Colorado was done through conventional wells, drilled vertically with the old nodding donkey oil pumps bringing fuel to the surface. But now it's very different. The modern practice of fracking and horizontal drilling really took off in this century around 2008 and beyond. And since then, there has been a lot of fracking in Colorado. This is a map of all of the oil and gas wells in Colorado, just to give you a sense of just how many oil and gas wells we have in this state. So 350 Colorado has been in the grassroots movement fighting fracking for over a decade now, from local ballot initiatives and regulations and supporting local communities fighting neighborhood fracking sites one by one to statewide ballot initiatives like 112 and supporting the passage of legislation, including SB 19-181, which really meant to overhaul the state's approach to oil and gas. And we've been working in this movement for all this time, and there's a lot of history here, right? I want to recommend a documentary called Fracking the System that really gives some of that background history, a documentary by Brian Haddon that I definitely recommend you checking out. But despite the changes that we have won here in Colorado, laws and regulations that we've helped affect change, the pace of fracking well approval has not slowed. And Coloradans continue to pay the costs of our health, to our safety, to our environment, to our economy, and to our climate. And now the industry is planning to expand fracking into our population centers on the Front Range. During a rulemaking proceeding this year, the industry told us they expect most future drilling will be in disproportionately impacted communities. That means Coloradans that are already living with more than their fair share of the pollution burden and other impacts. So this is really a grave environmental injustice that's happening right here in Colorado, a state that purports to value a clean environment, the great outdoors, and action on climate. So our work to curtail and hold accountable oil and gas extraction must continue. And right now, unfortunately, we're facing pretty much a total roadblock on passing new legislation to address extraction for the next couple of years. And so we have to think outside of that box and turn to other levers that we can reach. And fortunately, one lever we do have is the laws that are already on the books. Passing laws is great, but really enforcing them is even more important. So we're going to talk more about that here in this webinar. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy to teach us a little bit more about oil and gas facilities and infrastructure and the pollution that they emit. Jeremy, take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Bobby. So, yeah, I mean, fundamentally, we're all here and we're all interested in this issue because the oil and gas industry is a huge source of air pollution, not only climate forming or, fueling the climate crisis with carbon dioxide and methane emissions, but there's a whole host of other more toxic pollutants that are released from the oil and gas industry, and a link between the oil and gas industry in the Denver metro area and our summertime smog problem. So, just to like sum it all up, the oil and gas industry is an incredibly dirty industry. And I think we know that to a large degree, but it's just really important to emphasize from an air pollution standpoint. It basically means that pollution is released at every step of the way in this process, from drilling to fracking to completing a well to producing a well and into the life of the well. Just emissions released at every step of the way. Bobby, do you want to go to the next slide? So a lot of what we see is not the air pollution itself, but the sources of air pollution. And I think it's helpful to illustrate just what we're talking about in terms of the collective emission sources that are tied to the oil and gas extraction industry. So well sites are a very common site in the Denver metro area. And they contain a lot of pieces of equipment that are involved in pumping up gas and oil from the ground, separating gas from oil, separating water from the oil and the gas, and managing the waste all along the way. There are pieces of equipment like engines that help push gas through the system. Engines are a huge source of combustion-related emissions. Dehydrators, separators, these are equipment that separate oil from the gas. And then tanks, of course, are a very common sight. And then all these little sources, these little pieces of equipment, they all collectively add up to very large sources of air pollution. Bobby, do you want to go to the next slide? And another common site, just to flag this, is flares. And I really like to highlight this because when you think of flaring, you think of a big ball of flame on the end of a stick at like a refinery, like the Suncor refinery in Denver. But actually, the most common flaring that happens with oil and gas here in Colorado is the use of these what are called enclosed flares. Basically, it's a flare, it's a ball of flame, but it has a cylinder or pipe over it, so you can't really see the flame, and all the burning is happening inside that. These kinds of flares, these enclosed flares, are at virtually every oil and gas well site in not only the Denver metro area, but in Colorado. And there's a picture here of the heat signature you can see. But I also like to flag this if you want to go to the next slide, Bobby. We work in 350 Colorado works very closely with an organization called Earthworks. And what Earthworks does is they have staff who are certified in using infrared cameras to record air pollution at oil and gas well sites. Because more often than not, you can't see the pollution. The toxic emissions coming from equipment like engines and dehydrators and flares in this case, you don't usually see. They help expose it. They help us see it. And in this case, what they're showing us is this is a well site in the Denver metro area, and these are flares operating, but they're not burning the way they should. There's too much gas coming out, which we wouldn't otherwise see without the use of their optical gas imaging work. So we really like to highlight this. They do some great work. I know they've shown up to do webinars with 350 Colorado at times, and we work very closely together. Do you want to go to the next slide, Bobby? And I should add, Earthworks has a YouTube channel that you can just search Earthworks and just lots and lots of examples of exposing air pollution at oil and gas sites, not only in Colorado but other states. And it's a very helpful resource. So in case anybody's interested in digging more deeply there. So, specifically what we're talking about with this air pollution, one, ozone precursor emissions. So I mentioned ozone. Ozone is what's called a secondary pollutant. It forms when certain pollutants react with sunlight. So it's mainly a summertime problem. Um, the main precursors are volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides. The volatile organic compounds include a whole group of gases, some of which are very toxic, like benzene, which is a known carcinogen, but they collectively are very reactive. They like to evaporate and turn into gas in the presence of sunlight or heat. And these pollutants come from the oil and gas itself, really. Oil and gas is that they are both volatile organic compounds, basically. And the gases that are released as air pollution are the less desirable hydrocarbons, the waste hydrocarbons. So, oil and gas industry wants methane, but there's a whole other group of gases that come out with methane, and those are volatile organic compounds as well. And they try to separate that and get rid of all the waste, the other gases that aren't methane. And then nitrogen oxides are just a byproduct of combustion. So anytime you have engines or flares, you have a lot of nitrogen oxides. Air toxics, as I mentioned, a lot of volatile organic compounds are particularly harmful to human health, whether they're carcinogenic or just pose just more serious health impacts to people. The most common ones are the oil and gas industry: benzene, ethylbenzene, hexane. There's also formaldehyde, which is a big issue. They're all mostly related. And then greenhouse gases, both in terms of the byproduct of combustion, so all that engine burning, all the flaring, the lots of carbon dioxide, and then also methane. So methane is not only what the product that they're after, but as they lose some of their product that releases methane, which we all know is a very potent greenhouse gas. So very concerned, and all of this is related. We're very concerned about climate change, obviously, but the air pollution, the traditional problem like ozone, it's related. It's one and the same. We wouldn't have an ozone problem if we could confront the climate problem, and we wouldn't have a climate problem if we could deal with the ozone problem. So we like to highlight that because even though we're very laser focused on clean air and traditional air pollution issues, they're very, very related, and they're one and the same essentially. And it's all about holding the fossil fuel industry accountable to dealing with these emissions in a way that is protective of people and the planet, like I said. Uh, Bobby, you want to go to the next one? So this highlights just a kind of a drilling down on ozone precursor emissions, so the VOCs and the nitrogen oxide emissions. This is a breakdown of these precursor emissions in Denver metro counties. Larimer, Weld, Boulder, Broomfield, Adams, Arapahoe, Jefferson, Douglas, and Denver. And uh, what this shows is, yeah, there is a lot here, but the darker blue, and you can look at like the Weld County line on the far right. That's oil and gas emissions, oil and gas precursor emissions. And you just look at Weld County, which, of course, many of us know Weld County is the epicenter of fracking along the Front Range. And indeed, in terms of ozone forming emissions, the oil and gas industry is a giant. It's huge. It's a huge source. And together with VOCs and NOx, it releases more. The oil and gas industry is responsible for more ozone forming pollution than any other sector, more than cars and trucks on the road. So that's one reason why we are laser focused on confronting the oil and gas industry and its air pollution footprint. Do you want to go to the next slide, Bobby? And then with air toxics, just to emphasize, lots of health studies have come out. One recent study just came out around leukemia and the link to proximity to oil and gas well sites. So, ozone ozone is a big regional pollutant that is a respiratory irritant and can trigger asthma attacks and worsen lung disease. But these air toxics are particularly harmful. And really, the people impacted the most are the people in proximity who live in proximity, work in proximity, go to school in proximity to these oil and gas well sites. Do you want to go to the next slide? Um, and this highlights super emitters of greenhouse gases within the oil and gas industry. So big sources of methane emissions. This is an interesting page, and Ryan has looked at this a lot more than I have. But uh, we are finding that a lot of times the oil and gas industry, the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions aren't like big processing plants or refineries. A lot of times they're just production sites that the companies aren't just aren't paying attention to, and a lot of gas can be released, posing a tremendous impact to our climate. Do you want to go to the next slide, Bobby? And this is there's a whole carbon mapper site, and we can share that as a resource later. But it actually does map out using satellite imagery plumes of methane coming from the oil and gas industry. And this is one near Greeley, just highlighting it as an example. So this is the town of Greeley. This is the northeast side of Greeley, and there's a big plume of methane coming from a well site in the area. Want to go to the next slide?
There's a little bit of a delay there, but I think that covered the main points there. Jeremy, anything else you wanted to add, or Ryan?
I'll just quickly tag on. Yeah, we're seeing the use of satellite imagery growing. There are satellites being launched, or I would say a satellite per year, perhaps over the past few years. The target is typically greenhouse gases, but as Jeremy noted, these problems are inextricably connected. So like Earthworks, we're just trying to find ways to visualize the problem, understand what's actually happening on the ground. Right now, the satellite resolution is still somewhat broad so that we're not able to really hone in on specific components at facilities. But at a higher level, it helps us spot some of these really problematic facilities. And hopefully, the use of satellites will continue to grow and eventually be used for enforcement and cracking down on these really problematic polluters.
Great. Thank you. All right, well, with that overview, I'm next going to share a little bit of an introduction to the Clean Air Act and Title V permitting. So the Clean Air Act, as many of you probably know, is one of our major federal environmental laws, signed in 1970 by President Richard Nixon. And despite the decades of amendments and rulemakings and litigation, the Clean Air Act is still the law of the land today. And there's a lot under the Clean Air Act, right? It's one of the most complex areas of environmental law, but also one of the most powerful environmental laws in our history so far. And because it's had such significant impact on improving our air and saving countless lives. So under the Clean Air Act, the US EPA sets National Ambient Air Quality Standards, aka the NAAQS, which are standards that say this is the safe upper limit for a pollutant. Beyond that level of concentration in our air, it is unsafe for human health and welfare. The EPA has so far set NAAQS for 6 criteria pollutants: particulate matter, ozone, carbon monoxide, lead, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. And some of you may know Colorado's Front Range has a major problem with ozone, as we've talked about a little bit. And therefore, that part of the state, the metro and Front Range area, is a non-attainment area for the ozone NAAQS. And the Clean Air Act requires each state to implement the Clean Air Act in order to achieve the NAAQS. So for Colorado, that means the Department of Public Health and Environment, and specifically within that large agency, it's the Air Pollution Control Division that's charged with implementing and enforcing clean air laws and regulations in Colorado. And one of the main tools that the division uses for implementing the Clean Air Act is permitting. A permit is essentially a legal document that applies the law to a particular facility that is a source of air pollution. So the permit says, hey, facility, here are the rules that you have to follow. Here are the limits on what you can emit. This is what you must do to control your emissions. And this is the monitoring and record keeping and reporting that you must do too. So here is a map I want to show you of the division's map of all the permitted stationary sources of air pollution in Colorado. This just gives you a sense of how many sources there are. And this map includes non-oil and gas sources too, but you can see that in Weld County, around the metro area and up towards Weld County, there's a big mass of sources, and we know a lot of those sources are related to oil and gas. Here's a close-up of Weld County, where you can see just how many sources there are. And of course, that is the greatest concentration of oil and gas extraction in Colorado. The red shading behind that area is our ozone non-attainment area. So that brings us to Title V of the Clean Air Act, which was passed in 1990, and it created a federally mandated operating permit program to be implemented by the states. So state has a responsibility. A Title V operating permit, it collects and clarifies all of the different pollution control requirements that apply to a particular pollution source. So, and that includes monitoring, record keeping, and reporting to establish compliance. And Title V permits must be enforceable by the state and the US EPA and the public. So yes, even citizens, we have, provided that we have legal standing, we have the ability to enforce air permits. More to come on that. But first I want to introduce who must get a Title V permit. Well, Title V applies to major sources that emit or have the potential to emit pollutants beyond the threshold. And for our NAAQS pollutants, the default threshold is 110 tons per year. But in non-attainment areas, that threshold is ratcheted down. And the last thing that I want to share with you, before I go there, I want to mention regarding who must get a Title V permit, it's important to note that not all oil and gas infrastructure meets that threshold, that major source threshold. For example, well pads do not meet the threshold, typically once the temporary drilling and fracking work is done. But many of the other parts of the oil and gas extraction system do qualify for Title V. So infrastructure such as transfer stations and compressor stations, infrastructure similar to what's pictured here. And that brings me to my last part. I want to talk about the Title V permitting process, how it is supposed to work, right? So to start it out, a major source would apply for a Title V permit or a renewal permit. They must renew every 5 years. Then there is a 30-day public comment period. Then, if requested, the division is to hold a public hearing. Then the division is supposed to respond to public comments received. Then the division is supposed to submit that draft permit to the US EPA for a 45-day review period. And then, provided the EPA does not object to the permit, spoiler alert, they never object, the division then issues that final Title V permit. And after that, there is a 60 window where there's an opportunity to petition the US EPA to object to that permit. So that is how it is supposed to work, how this Title V permitting process is supposed to work, but it doesn't always work so well. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ryan and Jeremy to tell us more about the challenges and the failures in the system and our opportunities to intervene in the process on behalf of public health, safety, and the environment.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Bob.
Ryan, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. So, spoiler, there are a lot of issues in how the Title V permitting process is working in Colorado and elsewhere. One of the more fundamental problems is delay. So Bobby mapped out several steps that are mandated by the Clean Air Act itself, as well as state law. And there are specific deadlines tied to those steps, but those deadlines are often missed. And unfortunately, this isn't a situation where the permit has to come first before the facility can operate and pollute. Rather, they're not in any rush really because they get to pollute all the while they're waiting for their Title V permit. So, in the first place, there can be delays around applications and when the state regulator actually acts on applications for Title V permits. And those delays can take years. There's a state court option there that we and other groups have used in the past to compel action on Title V permits. But then that gets you to the state process and a comment period that we engage in. Like Bobby said, this is about evaluating all the levers. And so we pull that lever and try to urge the state to correct these permits, but typically it does not. And then we go to the EPA level because EPA must approve of these permits for them to become effective. And so there we have an opportunity to what's called petition EPA to object to the permit. We've had some luck there in the past with the change in administration. We do not anticipate having much luck at the EPA level, but once EPA issues an order on our petition where they decide whether to object to the permit as we've urged them to do or not, we do have an appeal option to Federal Circuit Court, the 10th Circuit in this instance. So, we all along the way have to sue to get EPA to respond to our petition on time. If we win on a petition, we have to sue to get the permit revised in accordance with EPA's order. So a big part of this is just fighting the fundamental delay in the process that's unfortunately inherent at essentially every step. And then there are broad thematic problems in terms of the content of these permits and the substance. Jeremy, do you want to start on that? I can continue.
Yeah, sure. So we're really focused on these Title V permits because they're oftentimes for the biggest and baddest sources of air pollution within the oil and gas industry, but they do afford us all these opportunities to try to chip away at attempts by industry and by the state to kind of cement in place loopholes or essentially free passes to pollute. So we want to keep the process going, but we really want to confront those loopholes or those free passes to pollute and really chip away at the oil and gas industry's ability to use the cover of a permit to basically pollute as much as it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants. So the center has been building a campaign around really deeply scrutinizing permits. Not only focusing on facilities that are particularly, offensive, very harmful to public health, like the Suncor oil refinery in North Denver, which, is the poster child for environmental injustice in Colorado, but also with an eye towards securing precedent, trying to raise the bar any way we can. And Ryan and I have been really focused on how flaring and how and I might be getting a little ahead here, but I'll circle back here. But flaring and venting of gas and pollution, and really working to ensure that these permits are as tight as possible, in terms of ensuring, really rigorous monitoring requirements and assuring that these standards actually mean something. That if there's a limit in place, that it actually is enforceable. That it actually there's reliable data that can be gathered, and we can actually determine whether or not a company is complying, for example, with venting gas emissions. Um, but we um, so that's been a big focus of ours, and it goes hand in hand with trying to ensure that these deadlines are being met and that applications are being processed and that permits are being acted upon. It's interesting. We sue the state for not issuing a permit for an oil and gas facility. It's not because we want to make sure there's a permit in place. I mean, we do, but it's because we want an opportunity to sink our teeth into it. We want an opportunity to be able to scrutinize it and not only provide comments and have a chance of convincing the state of Colorado to do better, but also then availing ourselves of the opportunity to get EPA to intervene. And I know there's probably going to be a question around, well, what about EPA now? We can answer that, but I will just say that the Clean Air Act and Title V in particular, the Clean Air Act, it's very strict. There are very strict provisions, and we're actually pretty confident that we'll still be able to make some progress and compel EPA to go along with us. Maybe not as resoundingly on some issues as in the last administration, but I think on some we're still going to make some progress. So we still view it as a very viable and fruitful opportunity to raise the bar and to press Colorado to be more aggressive in holding the oil and gas industry accountable to clean air and public health. And so we're going to keep at it. We actually over the last couple of years have commented on and petitioned on dozens of Title V permits for oil and gas facilities, including facilities in the Denver metro area, but also oil and gas on the Western Slope, which may not be fueling an urban ozone problem, but is impacting wild places, public lands, and is impacting communities, albeit smaller communities, but still communities that matter nonetheless. And so wherever we can, we want to assure that Colorado is not giving the industry a free pass to pollute. These permits should matter. They should mean something. And at the end of the day, the permits, if they can't be written in such a way to assure a company complies with the Clean Air Act, then technically they should be denied. And even though that's kind of like a very aspirational vision of ours to achieve that outcome, it is set forth in the law. And so it's something that we want to work toward, that if the state wants to allow companies to pollute, but there's no means of assuring that they can comply, we want those permits to go away and to be denied ultimately. Yeah, Ryan, I don't know if I touched on the most salient points of our work. Let's
Yeah,
see.
I'd like to just emphasize
Yeah.
one point implicit there, which is that while this takes the form of a permit by permit fight, we're looking at the broader programmatic failures on the part of the state and EPA, frankly. So, there's there's a lot of what looks to be copying and pasting in these permits where they're not reinventing the wheel every time they're issuing a Title V permit. There's a lot of redundancy, and that means the problems in one permit are most likely inherent to, hundreds of others. This infrastructure also is redundant. A lot of these facilities are very similar, broad strokes. Now, there are idiosyncratic issues that always come up with every permit, and we try to tackle that where we can. But we have certain thematic issues that we work on, like Jeremy, with flaring and venting of gas, and a few others. So we take this on permit by permit, but we're looking at permitting reform as the goal. Um, one other issue that I want to highlight, which I actually have seen kind of popping up in the chat, though I don't think I'm going to answer the one question directly, it relates to transparency, because as Bobby said, the Clean Air Act provides us with a role, the public, in enforcing and making sure these permits are being followed. But we can't do that job if we don't have access to the data and the types of information that facilities use to show compliance. And unfortunately, these permits largely allow facilities to keep that information to themselves. They are supposed to give it to the state, quote unquote, upon request, but the state doesn't request that information, and then we can't get it from the state. So there's been a major fight to push for more transparency around the air pollution data that's necessary to enforce these permits, and that's one example of the kind of thematic issue that we're working on, permit by permit, but targeting the broader permitting scheme as a whole.
Yeah, that's really important. Ryan just flagged there. So much of what the oil and gas industry does, is just completely behind a black curtain. So working to daylight their operations is critical. And then ultimately, the more that we can raise the bar with these Title V permits, the more we can broadly impact um, permitting for smaller facilities. Not, there are a lot of facilities that aren't subject to Title V, but they still should be subject to very stringent permitting requirements. The precedents we're setting in Title V permits are helping us influence other permitting actions. And then for the center standpoint, which I know this isn't as relevant for 350 Colorado, but we're working to make sure that the work we do in Colorado affects how the industry is permitted in other states like New Mexico, Wyoming, and Utah. So we want to make sure this transcends Colorado. Even as we're focused on Colorado and trying to make change here, we want to have an outsized impact ultimately.
Oh, sorry, Bobby, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that is really exciting and something that's cool about this new collaboration between our two organizations, right? The Center for Biological Diversity brings this nationwide focus, this deep expertise and knowledge, and 350 Colorado brings the real Colorado focus, right? We've been building this movement against fracking for over a decade. We've got boots on the ground, right? We've got frontline activists part of this movement, and together we're hoping we can really make some change here in Colorado that can have a ripple effect beyond our state.
Yeah, and seeing that we're kind of coming to the end of this segment, I would like to highlight just one area where we have had success, but continued to push as hard as we can in the Title V permitting context, and that relates to flaring, where per these permits, flares are supposed to work with a certain level of at a certain standard. They're supposed to destroy a certain amount of pollution, 95%. But these permits have to be enforceable pursuant to the law. So these permits need to contain other conditions besides just the number on the page, 95%, to make sure that that's a reality and flares are actually achieving that level of pollution destruction. And so we've challenged, as Jeremy said, dozens of permits on this basis. Over the past couple of years, we've had success with oil and gas well pads, a gas processing facility, where the state has rejected our arguments there, but then EPA agreed that these permits didn't contain the conditions necessary to make sure flares are working like they're supposed to. And EPA sent the permits back to the state. And in one instance, this process takes time, so we're still seeing the consequences of that decision by EPA. But one permit has been revised to include testing of flares, which we don't think the testing takes place often enough and isn't stringent enough. So it's just one step forward, but we are seeing successes. And so with that kind of proof of concept, we're just going to keep the pressure on and keep trying to strengthen these permits.
Thank you. Well, I want to spend the next few minutes speaking a little bit about how 350 Colorado members and supporters can support this work. This is a grassroots campaign, right? And grassroots campaigns are fueled by grassroots donations. So one of the most important ways that we can support this work is by making a donation to fund it. And so I'd like to invite everyone here who's in a position to give to donate to fund this important work, this new and exciting direction where 350 Colorado can team up with our partners and allies here at the Center for Biological Diversity and engage in some legal action to intervene on behalf of health and safety in our environment. So legal action like this requires concerted effort and the development of expertise that must be sufficiently funded. This will take some of our time, some of our staff time, including my time as our 350 Colorado staff attorney. And I've also started a legal internship program where student attorneys from Colorado's law schools can assist with this work, which will help reduce some of our costs. But even that, teaching and supervising student attorneys also takes time and investment. So there are other expenses involved in this kind of work, maintaining legal license and training and credentials. And then the costs that come with pursuing legal action, everything from filing fees to certified mailings and potentially travel to court appearances and other incidentals. So 350 Colorado is looking to raise $40,000 to launch this new legal action effort this year. And the more we raise, the more we can do with this work and the more we can partner with the Center for Biological Diversity. So every grassroots dollar raised for this effort will be put to good use in maximizing our impact on this strategy. So we welcome your generous donations now to help us launch and sustain this exciting new direction to address oil and gas pollution in Colorado through legal action. You can use the QR code that's there on the screen or the link, and we'll also place the link in the chat. So thank you so much for supporting this work. And other ways to help include joining 350 Colorado's Fracking Action Committee. We are a committee of volunteers that meet twice a month at this time on Zoom Thursday evenings. And we would love to have you join in to plug in, learn more, and be a part of this as we're getting the ball rolling on this legal action strategy. So that link will be in the chat, as well as I invite you all to attend our next webinar on the communications and public education strategy that's part of our People Over Polluters campaign. So that webinar is coming up on April 3rd, 6 to 7 p.m. on Zoom, link in the chat. And another way that I want to share, this is exciting, this is a new one, save the date for our next Fracking Pollution and Action Tour. We'll be hosting a fracking tour with our partners at Earthworks, who you heard a little bit about tonight, on Saturday, May 3rd in the Firestone Frederick area in Colorado. This is a chance to see for yourself that pollution from oil and gas infrastructure through their optical gas imaging camera. We saw that little video clip tonight, but you'll be able to see it in person yourself. So we'll be looking at facilities that are subject to Title V. So you don't want to miss it. So keep an eye out for the sign up for that. It will definitely be on our website and on the People Over Polluters webpage that we also have a link for in the chat. So those are some ways that you can support this work and be a part of this exciting new direction, this collaboration between our two organizations, 350 Colorado and the Center for Biological Diversity. So with that, we're going to make some time for some questions. I know we have some questions coming in on the chat. Let's get into it. Heidi will be our question moderator for this evening. What's our first question, Heidi?
Yeah, hi everybody. There have been a lot of great questions in the chat, and Jeremy touched a little bit on the question about EPA potentially repealing rules that would affect the Clean Air Act. Is there anything else that you would want to say about that, Jeremy?
Just that, it is real. I mean, they are trying to roll back really important clean air and climate rules, and they're definitely going to do some damage. But we still have some very powerful laws in place. The Clean Air Act is still a very powerful law. And we have ways to compel them to act, even if they don't believe they uh, can or should. It's going to be a fight for sure. We're going to be in court a lot, but that's why the judicial branch exists, to hold the executive branch accountable to doing what the laws said they should be doing. So we're going to keep at it, but we also know that yeah, it's going to be a slog over the next 4 years.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Ryan, you also alluded to the question about data, talking about how important transparent data is. Do either of you want to say anything about potential federal data that might be disappearing online with scrubbing of climate and pollution data? Is that anything that would be of a concern here in Colorado, and how could we deal with that?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. I mean, it's alarming. My perception is this administration only really survives through mis and disinformation. And so scrubbing efforts are an important part of their plan. I know that we and other major groups have done the opposite of scrubbing, where we've just been downloading everything that's been available to keep it alive in our own systems. But then some of those data collection efforts may not continue at the same level that they will. So, you know, I saw, I believe it was Bill in the chat noted that uh, the state uses rose-colored glasses and basically just makes a lot of assumptions about what kinds of pollutants and the level of the amounts that are coming out of these facilities, and uses those assumptions to permit these facilities rather than understanding what's actually happening with them. That is not a new problem whatsoever. It's not a problem that this administration is going to fix, but that's why efforts like by groups like Earthworks, hopefully satellite imagery down the road, where data collection is not in the hands of the government itself, are so important. So, yeah, there's not a fix here. It's happening. It does affect how we understand the problem, but we will continue to look for ways around the issue. The graph that Jeremy presented showing Weld County's ridiculous ozone precursor emissions, that's from the National Emissions Inventory that EPA compiles. But EPA has to compile that pursuant to federal international treaties. As we pull out of those, what happens to the NEI data? Our work is certainly affected by this, but we've preserved what we can, and we'll continue to develop what we can.
Thanks, Ryan. And with you mentioning the satellite data, that's a great segue to the next question. Wondering about the methane satellite data. And I do believe also EDF has a satellite data system that is live and running. That was Leslie Glustrom's question about, can we see methane emission issues in Weld County and around Colorado in relatively current time?
Yeah, so the satellite data collection efforts are still somewhat in their infancy, where, yes, EDF launched a satellite, I believe it was early last year, Methane Sat. Carbon Mapper has one, Tanager one. They complement that data with airplane flyover studies. Um, so those efforts are growing. EDF, in addition to launching the satellite, did uh, push for inclusion in federal regulation that advanced measurement techniques can be used, hopefully, to eventually enforce emission limits. But the data still has a ways to go to be actionable, I think. Partly because of what I identified, the resolution, where it's not able to zoom in so far enough for us to at this point, based on what I've seen, sue over a result. But we can get a broader perception, and especially where you start to look at area-wide emissions, the satellite data can help. And yeah, the the satellites are flying over pretty regularly, so the data is pretty fresh, where you can see plumes from facilities, from the the real high emitters in fairly real time. And yeah, the Carbon Mapper resource, if you search Carbon Mapper data portal, you can click right in. That shows plumes, has the date of measurement, and they even try to quantify the amount of methane which is coming out of these facilities.
Yeah. And when you were talking about why the state or the fact the state doesn't request data from the facilities and that it's not necessarily transparent, Randy popped a question in at that time, but maybe we could come to it now. Why doesn't the state request that data? Is there a way for us to get them to request it more often? And does that impede our work on the kinds of legal work that we're going to be involved in?
Yeah, I'll kind of take those questions in reverse order. It certainly impedes our work because this is the air pollution data that's showing whether or not they're complying with their permits. It's not the best data because again, it's not often direct measurement of emissions, but rather assumptions based on um, kind of general parameters that are applied to these facilities. So a lot of it is just moving numbers around on a page, but it's still important and it's still useful. I do think this is a situation where grassroots efforts to push the state to request more records could really be effective because they just deny us because they don't want to set that precedent for themselves. They could request records on our behalf that we could then use, either obtain directly if they were generous enough to provide them, or use a public records request, the state FOIA, Colorado Open Records Act, to get that data. Why doesn't the state do it? I have theories. I think some of it has to do with plausible deniability. If they're not requesting all these records that may be showing violations, then they're not on the hook for not enforcing against those violations. Capacity, I think, is part of it. This problem is out of hand for them. The scale of oil and gas production has quadrupled over the last 15 years since the fracking revolution. Um, and they just haven't kept up with their enforcement arm and their investigative arm. So that's not making an excuse for them. They should be pushing to make sure that they can keep these facilities in check. And if they can't, they should do something about that. But yeah, I don't think they have a great reason because they're supposed to make sure these facilities are following their permits, following the law, and without that data, they're many steps behind doing that.
Thanks, Ryan. Bobby, do we have time for one more question? I think we might be a little nearing the end here.
Yeah, I think we wrap it up and trying to stick on time tonight. Thank you so much for the questions. We'll save the chat and we can help follow up with further questions after this session. But for now, I just want to wrap up with a couple more points. I'm going to share my screen one more time if I can get it to work. Computer's moving slow. All right, just a reminder on some ways that you all can support this work. I'm putting the links in the chat again. But to fund this new collaboration and this legal strategy for 350 Colorado to be a partner and in collaboration with the center, we need grassroots donations to fund this grassroots campaign. So that's one really important way to help support this work. And then if you want to plug in, learn more, get involved, I welcome you to join our Fracking Action Committee. We meet twice a month on Zoom to learn, connect across our movement, and take action together to curtail oil and gas impacts in Colorado. I definitely welcome everyone to attend our next webinar as part of this People Over Polluters campaign, where we'll be having a webinar all about the public education and communication strategy to rein in oil and gas impacts in Colorado. That'll be on April 3rd. And then finally, save the date for that fracking pollution and action tour. Like I said, we'll be out in the field looking at infrastructure, looking at the pollution through an optical gas imaging camera from Earthworks in the Firestone and Frederick neighborhood area region of Colorado on May 3rd. So save the date for now. A sign up will be coming soon on the People Over Polluters webpage, link shared in the chat. And with that, I want to say thank you, a huge round of applause, and thank you to our guest speakers from the Center for Biological Diversity. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Jeremy. We are so excited about this opportunity to be a part of this powerful legal work that you've all been doing for quite some time. And I've shared our contact information there, our email, should any of you like to get in touch with Ryan or Jeremy or myself.
Yeah, please reach out to us. Our contact information is on this presentation. It's online. Happy to answer any additional questions. And these issues impact all of us in Colorado. So definitely want to the extent you're concerned or want to throw some ideas our way, let's connect.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar. Thanks for being a part of this movement and all that you do in all the different ways to protect people and the planet. Thank you for being a part of 350 Colorado. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.